Adolf Hitler. By the final week of April 1945, the man who had reshaped the world through destruction was reduced to hiding beneath it, deep inside a concrete bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Hitler spent his last days surrounded by a handful of loyalists as Soviet forces closed in from every direction above. The city was falling block by block. His generals had stopped bringing good news because there was none left to bring. On April 29th, with the sounds of artillery growing closer by the hour, Hitler married his companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony held in the bunker's map room. The following afternoon, the two retreated to their private quarters. Those waiting outside heard a single gunshot. When staff entered minutes later, they found Hitler dead from a gunshot wound to the head. A crushed cyanide capsule also present. Eva had taken only the poison. Their bodies were carried up the bunker stairs into the Chancellery garden, doused in gasoline, and set alight while Soviet shells landed nearby. There was no funeral, no ceremony, just smoke rising over a ruined city. He was 56 years old. What remained of the Reich surrendered within days. Benito Mussolini. Mussolini did not die on a stage or a balcony. He died on the side of a road in a borrowed coat trying to slip across the Swiss border unnoticed. By late April 1945, the man who had declared Italy's new Roman Empire was fleeing through the Italian countryside, disguised among German soldiers. Communist partisans stopped the convoy at a checkpoint near Lake Como on April 27th and found him crouched in the back of a truck. He and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were held overnight and shot the following day at the gate of a villa in a small village called Giulino di Mezzegra. Their bodies were then transported to Milan, to a public square called Piazzale Loreto, the same location where Mussolini's regime had displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans months earlier. By dawn on April the 29th, a crowd had gathered. What followed was ugly. The bodies were kicked, spat upon, and fired into again. One woman reportedly discharged 5 rounds into Mussolini's corpse, one for each of her sons the war had taken. Then the bodies were strung upside down from the roof of a gas station. The crowd cheered beneath them. The man who had stood before thousands demanding their devotion ended his life as a spectacle for their fury. Joseph Stalin. Stalin had spent 3 decades making people afraid of him, and in the end, that fear may have been what killed him. On the night of March 1st, 1953, he hosted a late dinner at his private residence outside Moscow, drinking with the small circle of senior officials who served him and feared him in equal measure. Everyone left in the early hours of the morning. By midday on March 2nd, no summons had come from his quarters. His staff knew the schedule, knew the silence was wrong, and did nothing. No one dared enter without being called. It was not until that evening that someone finally looked inside and found Stalin on the floor, partially paralyzed from a massive stroke, conscious but unable to speak, lying in his own urine. He had been there for approximately 12 hours. Doctors were brought in, but the delay had already determined the outcome. He lingered for 4 days. Breathing labored, face contorted, his body shutting down, while the men who feared him stood at his bedside. On March 5th, 1953, Stalin died. The terror that had kept an entire nation silent had kept his own staff from entering a room, and that silence had cost him whatever chance he had. He was 74 years old. Rafael Trujillo. Trujillo had ruled the Dominican Republic for 31 years, through fear, violence, and absolute control, ordering killings the way other heads of state signed legislation. On the night of May 30th, 1961, he was being driven along a highway outside Santo Domingo when several vehicles forced his car to stop. The men who stepped out were not strangers. Many were military officers who had served under him for years. They had been planning this for months with quiet backing from the CIA, who had grown tired of the instability Trujillo's brutality created in the region. The ambush was brief and overwhelming. His car was riddled with gunfire. Some accounts suggest Trujillo managed to draw his own weapon and return fire before being struck multiple times. He died on the roadside, the same fate he had arranged for countless others. His body was loaded into one of the assassin's vehicles, and for hours the conspirators drove around uncertain what to do next. Some were captured within days and executed, others fled. The country slid into political chaos. Trujillo had built his entire regime on the idea that he was untouchable, and he spent his final minutes learning otherwise. Nicolae Ceausescu. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were tried, convicted, and executed on Christmas Day, 1989, and the entire thing was filmed. Romania's anti-communist revolution had moved faster than anyone anticipated. On December 22nd, with protesters overwhelming Bucharest, the Ceausescus fled the capital by helicopter. They were captured within hours. 3 days later, on December 25th, they were brought before a makeshift military tribunal in a small room at a base in Targoviste. The trial lasted less than an hour. Charges included genocide and the embezzlement of state funds. Elena spent much of the proceedings insisting the court had no legal authority. The verdict was death. Minutes after sentencing, the couple was led into a courtyard. They were given no time for final words beyond the protests they had already made inside. A firing squad opened fire, and both dropped almost immediately. More than 100 rounds were fired between them. Romanian state television broadcast confirmation of their deaths that evening, and footage spread internationally within days. Images of a man who had ruled for 24 years, gone in under 72 hours from the moment his regime collapsed. Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi had ruled Libya for 42 years and died hiding in a drainage pipe. During Libya's 2011 civil war, rebel forces had steadily dismantled what remained of his government, pushing him from Tripoli to his hometown of Sirte, where he held out for weeks as the situation grew increasingly desperate. On October 20th, NATO airstrikes destroyed his convoy as it attempted to leave the city. Gaddafi survived the strike and fled on foot, taking cover inside a concrete culvert with a small group of bodyguards. Rebel fighters found him there and pulled him out. Multiple phones were recording within seconds. The footage showed a disoriented, bloodied Gaddafi being dragged through crowds of fighters, his face swollen, his uniform torn. In one recording, he's heard asking what is happening and what he has done wrong. The fighters around him were shouting, striking him, pulling him in different directions. The precise sequence of what followed remains disputed, but Gaddafi was shot in the head and died shortly after being pulled from that culvert. His body was subsequently displayed in a commercial freezer in Misrata, where people lined up to see it for several days before he was buried in an unmarked grave in the desert. Location undisclosed. Pol Pot. Pol Pot oversaw the deaths of up to 2 million Cambodians and died in his sleep in a bamboo hut, never spending a single day in a courtroom. After the Khmer Rouge regime collapsed in 1979, he retreated to the jungle near the Thai border and spent nearly 2 decades living as a fugitive while the world debated how to bring him to justice. By 1998, he was 73, frail and under house arrest by a splinter faction of his own former movement, men who had decided he had become a liability. On April 15, 1998, he was found dead in his bed. The reported cause was heart failure. The timing was extraordinarily convenient. Just days earlier, the remaining Khmer Rouge leadership had reached an agreement to transfer him to international authorities for trial. Instead, he died before anyone could move. Knowing the world would be skeptical, his former comrades invited journalists to photograph the body, a rare and deliberate act of transparency from a movement that had operated in total secrecy for decades. The images ran in newspapers globally. There would be no trial, no testimony, no moment where survivors could look him in the eye. He was cremated on a pile of tires and scrap wood. The man responsible for one of the 20th century's worst atrocities left no grave-worth markings. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's execution was supposed to be controlled and solemn. Someone brought a phone. On December 30th, 2006, following his conviction for crimes against humanity, Saddam was led into an execution chamber at a military facility in Baghdad just before dawn. He was composed, dressed in a dark coat, reciting prayers quietly as a noose was placed around his neck. Then the taunting began. Guards and officials in the room started shouting sectarian insults, goading him in his final moments. Saddam responded with defiance, continuing to pray, refusing to be rattled. The floor dropped. It was over quickly, but the phone footage leaked within hours, and by that evening it was being broadcast globally. A grainy, chaotic video of a former head of state being jeered at on a gallows. The reaction split sharply along political and cultural lines. For many Iraqis, it was justice, however imperfect. For others, the manner of it undermined the legal process that had taken years to construct. His body was returned to his family and buried in his hometown of Tikrit. Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet is the entry on this list that frustrates historians the most because he is the one who got away. He seized power in Chile in a 1973 coup, ruled for 17 years, and oversaw the torture, killing, and disappearance of thousands of Chilean citizens. Then he grew old, hired good lawyers, and died in a hospital bed surrounded by family. By 2006, he was 91 and had spent years using declining health as a legal shield against prosecution. In 1998, he had been arrested in London on Spanish human rights warrants, only to be released on medical grounds and returned to Chile. Back home, indictments accumulated: human rights abuses, embezzlement, tax evasion, but proceedings were repeatedly delayed on the grounds that he was too ill to stand trial. On December 3, 2006, he suffered a massive heart attack and was rushed to a military hospital in Santiago. An emergency surgery was performed. Over the following week, his condition worsened. Additional cardiac events, pulmonary edema, organ strain. On December 10, 2006, Augusto Pinochet died. The date was International Human Rights Day. He was 91 years old and had never been convicted of anything. When the news broke, Santiago split. Celebrations, some streets, mourning in others. He was cremated and his ashes were divided among family members. No public grave, no marker, no accountability. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which dictator you want us to cover next. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There's a lot more where this came from.